good evening. My name is Tommi Himberg and I'll be talking about emotions in motion. So this is a presentation about studies that we've done on social interaction. And I would actually like to start with a demonstration. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to stand up and pick a pair. So this is a mirror game. So you have a pair, you stand facing your pair. You can pick one hand, whichever. If there are three of you, you can have a triangle as well. It works in a triangle too. So just point a finger and point two fingers at each other. Distance about 5 to 10 centimeters. Okay? And then you start doing creative improvisatory movement. So you start drawing in the air, and the other person is starting to follow. So the person who's closer to the window is now the leader. Okay? And the other person is supposed to follow the movement of the finger as closely as possible, as well as possible. Okay? Now you can be creative. You can be artistic. You can think of this as a dance. Okay, and keep moving and then switch roles so the other person becomes the leader. You can change fingers if you feel tired, but you don't have to. Okay. Step number 3. Change roles again so that now you both are leaders. So no one's deciding what to do. You just let movement emerge. No leaders, no followers, just movement. Okay. And the very final stage, I guess you must have been focusing mostly on the other person's finger. Now keep on moving and look at their eyes. Very non-Finnish eye contact. Okay, thank you. That's it. Well done. Excellent dancing. Let's give a little applause in the between. So let's bank this thought for a moment. And let's talk first about a couple of reasons why we study interaction as live. As I mentioned, there are new phenomena that occur and take place only in live interaction, stuff that you can't see if you only do like in classical, traditional psychology where you have a laboratory somewhere and then you take people individually, one at a time. You control everything that they meet at the laboratory, everything that they do. Everyone has exactly the same experiment and same experience. So what we try to do is rather than have, because if you have two people doing anything together, you're never going to have the same experience. It's always unique, it's always different. From one pair to another, you can never control. If you let people have some control over their lives and what they do in your lab, then you're never going to have perfect control. So we have to be smarter than that. Because at the same time, we think that this is exactly the kind of psychology that we should be studying. So one kind of very, very fundamental reason for this kind of approach is that humans are social animals. So this is social interaction, this kind of live, quick reactions to other people. This is basically one of the things that we do really, really well. We collaborate, we cooperate, and that's pretty much what has well, it's maybe behind some of the bad things, but it's also behind the good things that humans do, like the Academy of Sciences and Letters, for instance. It's all about collaboration. So one way of describing this from evolutionary perspective is to say that we have evolved what some people have called capacity for culture. So this is kind of set of cognitive tools, some linked to motivation, some just linked to perception, some linked to emotions, that all coming together allow us to work in collaboration with other people. So it's one thought experiment where if you think about, you've probably taken a flight or taken a train very recently. So imagine the same kind of enclosed space and now replace all the humans in the space with chimpanzees. And imagine what kinds of fighting you can get. Not bonobos, they would do other things, but chimpanzees. Anyway, if we want to then, as many people have argued, that we should study behavior, and we should study psychology in a kind of natural environment. That environment is mostly social, so that we have to find ways in including other people into our studies and the kind of processes that happen between people, rather than just probing individual characteristics of individuals' perception, for instance, or individuals' neural activity. What we want is we want to get into a situation and look at the situation where people are interacting with each other. And the reason is that there are things that happen in interaction that don't happen when you don't have it. And this is a case where you cannot just do it so that you have many individuals and then you try to kind of imagine what would happen if you would have two people. So you can't extrapolate into 2 or 3 or 4 people what happens in just one person. Non-linear. One way of calling this is one way of describing what's going on is participatory sense making. So all the situations, all objects in our environments and other people, they become meaningful in the interaction that we have with them. So this is a very old theory, very old idea that has been described in many different ways, but this is one of the more recent ones. So what you were doing just now is something that we have done in a lab. And we have been using a motion capture system, which is a way of measuring movement in 3 dimensions, or 4 if we take time. So 3 spatial and one temporal dimension. So we had people come into the motion lab. They put on suits with reflective markers, and they have cameras all around them. And then they do these kinds of games or whatever else, and we can measure the positions of the markers very accurately, both in space and in time. And from that we can do then analysis on their interaction or features of their behavior. So in these cases, some of the important aspects that we have realized and how we plan our experiments. First of all, we focus on the interaction and not the participants. So this is not like a traditional psychology experiment where we log people's reaction times to things and then log their reaction times in 2 different conditions and then hope to accumulate large enough numbers of participants that we can see some kind of statistical difference between behavior A and behavior B. Instead, what we do is we try to focus on what goes on between people. So this typically means that we have to be quite smart in terms of the measures that we use. The second point that tends to be very important is that we cannot just take static measurements, or we don't like doing averages over what people do. Rather, we find that there's lots of information in how things evolve. Like in the experiment we tried in the beginning, you were starting in one kind of configuration, and then we were changing the configuration, we were changing the parameters of your interaction, moving from one stage to another. And then our analysis would be to see what changes in your behavior when we change those parameters. So one way of, again, like we use partly similar terminology than theoretical physicists, so we can change the coupling parameters between people and then see how the outcomes change. The difference is that we still have some easy questions to answer. So a couple of things that typically characterize these kinds of interaction and things that we can measure from it is that we look at the accuracy or coordination or the amount of entrainment. So how, in the case of your finger following, so how closely you follow the other person, for instance. How similar your trajectories are, or if we look at kind of unpack the movement in phase space, we look at the kind of phase synchrony and look at how similar you are in that sense. And then the other important thing is that who's actually driving the movement, so who is deciding where to go, who is the leader, who is the follower, especially in the cases where it's not explicitly instructed, and even in cases where it is explicitly instructed, it's interesting to study whether the person who's been given the leadership role is actually the person leading and deciding what to do in that relationship. And then, of course, we try to unpack what kinds of features might explain the likelihood of someone being a leader or someone being a follower. And then one thing, the experiment that we tried is a simplification of what people do often in improvisation theater. It's so-called mirror game, where one actor is the actor and the other person acts as the mirror. So we were just doing this very simple thing, which is easy to describe in 2D, or even 1D if we want to kind of reduce and simplify it even further. In the real improvisation theater thing, it's a full body experiment where you can move in all kinds of ways. You can have facial gestures, you can have expressions in your face, and everything needs to be mirrored. So this is an interesting phenomena coming from the field of arts, and it's been then adapted to the field of studying interaction, where it's been reduced to still contain some kind of interesting core of the phenomenon, while stripping out everything that's not necessary and everything that could be problematic for the study. So this is a very good example, I think, of arts-based research. And what we do, I will talk about another research project for the second half of this talk, which is our study where we use contemporary dance as the kind of inspiration of a study. If you want to see quickly what you were just doing and the kinds of results that we get from these experiments, here are a couple of pictures. So here's a cross-correlation of this behavior. So typically, so the lag here means like the temporal distance between me doing this and my partner then doing this afterwards. Correlation coefficient, this is like just how correlated people are. So this analysis tells us as a snapshot, as an average, even though I just told you we don't like averages. We don't like kind of compressing time, but we did here. So this tells us when A is leading, the blue curve, that the B is then following them with like a 0.1, 0.2 seconds lag. And when you switch roles, so that B leads, then A is following with a similar lag. So now the real interesting question is what happens when you share leadership. And it seems that they're both now following each other at this very similar lag. So this is an interesting finding. The same thing happens in this kind of fluent movement, and exactly the same thing has been observed when people are doing kind of rhythmical behaviors. Then if we unpack time, if we look at the dynamics, we can then ask, so how is this mutual following organized? Is it me following first and then you following the next 5 seconds? So we make another picture. So here the time flows from on the x-axis, and lag is now on the vertical, and the kind of peaks that you just saw are now colors. And this indicates that there's actually this kind of following, mutual following takes place all through, so that there are no clear turns in following, but it's actually simultaneously both are following each other, or at least the changes are very, very rapid. Okay, then quickly to the other project. So here are a couple of other examples of motion capture experiments and motion and interaction experiments that we have been running or currently are running. So one interesting thing is we are developing a 4-person version of this mirror game, which is quite funky. Then there's a conversation analysis collaboration where we are using motion capture, eye tracking, audio analysis, video analysis to look at what goes on in people when they're having conversations. It's hopefully very, very soon out, the first paper from that project. And then the third big part is that we are doing this in 2-person MEG. So there's one person in Otaniemi lab and another one in another lab somewhere, and they're doing these kinds of similar things, that we are measuring both brains at the same time. So I'll maybe talk about that at some later date when we have more data and more results. Anyway, now finally, a quick example of arts-based social interaction research that we did. So this is Social Emotions, which is a 2-year project funded by Konef Foundation, and our aim in this project was to try to understand especially the emotional interaction, so how we communicate emotions using body movement, and how the emotional contagion takes place both between dancers in this case, and then between dancers and their audience. And this was I was the PI of this project. We had a couple of other movement researchers, and then the kind of powerhouse of our artistic side are Jarkko Lehmus and Johanna Nuutinen, who are choreographer dancers. And then in a later stage, we recruited a composer and 2 cellists to create us a musical part of the outcome, so to speak. And it's all been we have been in the loving care of Riitta Hari and Tero Saarinen from the beginning. Their help and advice has been very useful, and funding Koneen-säätiö and Aalto. So we had 3 design features in this project. First of all, we wanted to study the embodiment. So instead of, like in very traditional emotion research, it's usually verbal or some kind of pen and paper test. So you're looking at static faces, and then you're trying to decide whether they are happy or sad. Of course, exaggerating extremely widely, but that's kind of the standard. The second part is that we wanted this to be social, so it's about interaction, and it's not just individual, and it's not about just me trying to pick an emotion. We wanted to study emotions in an interaction. And then finally, it needs to be dynamic, so instead of talking about emotional states, we wanted to have something that's a little bit more moving, so to speak. And quickly, project outline. We had a long period of half a year, I would say, of artistic research, just looking through the embodied aspects of a whole list of emotions. So this is Jarkko's and Johanna's doing mostly. Then we narrowed it down for our other research that we were looking at loving and loathing. So these really, really strong, really polar opposite social emotions. And Jarkko and Johanna came to our mocap lab, and we did a number of different versions of recordings. Both loving, both loathing, one loving, the other one loathing, then one changing from one end to another while the other staying in their emotion, and so on and so forth. So all kinds of versions. And here's a photo of that session. Then from the motion capture, we did kinematic analysis. So this is a standard fare, what we do. We just take all the data and then extract all kinds of kinematic features, accelerations, velocities, jerks, angles, positions, postures, distances, etc. Then we also applied movement synthesis. So based on having these extreme emotions, we have a movement synthesis software that allows us to generate other versions of the same movement but with different emotional features. So this is Klaus Förger's strong part, or his PhD thesis basically is on this. And then finally we used some of those synthesized animations and some of the original animations in a perceptual experiment, asking people how they feel, what emotions they perceive in the movement, just to see, kind of close the loop in that way. And then finally, the outcome that we wanted to have is an artistic performance that has science in it, or a scientific presentation that has lots of art in it. So it's kind of a hybrid in that sense. So here's an example of what they were doing. One of our mocaps. This is original data. So here, green, Jarkko is in the loving mood, and Johanna in the blue is in a more kind of a loathing. And here you see that the loathing or hate is more of a self-hate, and there's a very kind of complex description or a story about what the loving is and what the loathing is. And very important is that the feeling is something that is directed, that the feeling is not just an abstract feeling, it's something about their relationship. So this is how they feel about their relationship, and that's crucial. So they did different kinds of versions that we analyzed. And then we put everything, we extracted about 372 kinematic features from the dances, and then we put them into a principal component analysis to see what dimensions would describe these movements. So here, the first principal component nicely separates the loathing dances, which are the performances, which are the blue ones, from the loving ones, which are the red ones. And most of the kinematic feature that happens here is all velocity related. So if you're moving faster, you're more likely to be kind of perceived as loving, or kind of more likely guess is that you are trying to depict loving. And the second principal component in this is about how similar the two characters' movements are. So this is basically, these two features quite nicely map our data. I can explain this closer in more detail in discussion if you like. Then, just one point about the perceptual experiment. We had a number of different rounds, descriptions of one-word descriptions, and then we asked people to rate these not on whether it was loving or loathing, but on these kind of classical arousal and valence dimension scales. So if we ask people to rate whether it's positive or negative, whether it's low arousal or high arousal, we get kind of the basic emotions kind of nicely mapped. And then in this case, because we had two people, we also wanted to have this third dimension, which is dominance, so whether there's a very clear leader or whether it's more kind of an equal fair. And just one result from this. So if we look here, it's the loving and loving and hate. So basically two polar opposites. And we ask people what kind of feeling is this green character now depicting. We get, if they are loving, we get a higher positive rating. If we see them hating, we get like a neutral rating. So even the kind of loathing movement, when you reduce it into an animated stick figure, it's kind of perceived as neutral rather than negative. However, when we then keep the exact same performance, but then swap the other participant or the other stick figure in the animation, like here. So now people are still rating the loving and the hating, but the partner is now depicting the opposite behavior or the opposite emotion. We see that the loving is no longer considered as positive, so it drops down 1 point in a scale. And now the loathing, when you see a loving person as the other, is actually, you're getting more negative from there. So this is an example of this kind of a switch that and these kind of social effects that we see in this data quite a lot. Now finally, and to conclude, I will show you the trailer of our artistic final outcome of the project. So this is a duet for two cellists, two dancers, and one scientist. And the audience gets to vote. There's a mobile app or like a Google form where they choose emotions for the pair or for the duet, and then they act them out, and lots of emotional communication and contagion goes on. So here's a quick sample. So all the musical material and movement material is pre-composed, but it's improvised in the moment, depending on what the emotional characteristics are, or what the emotional direction is from the audience. And it's done a few times so that the audience can be an experimenter. They can try voting for different things and see how they change movement and emotion. I'm hoping we'll have a performance sometime in the beginning of next year, also in Helsinki, so I'll make sure to invite you all. And I think I'll conclude here. Thank you.